Ishmael, Jethro, York, Titus, Venus, Hagar, Caesar, Hannibal, Arabella, Samson, Chloe, Job, quite a few Jobs, Prince, Sarah, Dinah, Lydia, Jacob, and on it goes. In our research, we uncovered the list that you have in the book. It's our first interlude in the book. We simply decided to let the list all but speak for itself. We uncovered more than 200 names. Sometimes they are simply called unnamed slave boy or girl, and so on. Rarely a second name, a surname, once in a while. That list is now over 250 because our small research team is still at this in the Beinecke. I did a little tour yesterday for the staff of the Macmillan Center it was a tour of Connecticut Hall, Woodbridge, and Wolsey Hall, where the War Memorial is, and I had Hope McGrath with me. Hope, are you here today? Sometimes she comes. She's going to make it so I have to rewrite this book. I mean, they just keep finding things. We're over 250 names. These are names of enslaved people, mostly Africans or African Americans, some native, who were enslaved by Yale professors, rectors, donors, presidents, alumni, and others related to Yale, graduates of Yale, through the 18th century. We stopped at about 1800, a little after 1800. I would invite you to simply let your eyes roll over those lists of names and see what happens. It's hard. You can't identify them any more than they are with a single name, although we learned a little bit about some of them. But just let yourself go through the names. There are some Anglo-Saxon names. There are a whole variety of classical names, Cato, others, and a whole larger variety of biblical names. They tend to be in those three categories. Sometimes they surely named themselves, but often they were named by their owners. Ezra Stiles, as enslaved man, was named Newport, for the city in which he purchased him. That same Newport worked for Ezra Stiles for 20-odd years until Stiles was appointed president of Yale in 78, 79, at which point Stiles was beginning to really feel the Enlightenment, one might say. I'll come to him in a minute. And he liberated Newport, although Newport followed Stiles over here and ended up living his life here, living out his life here. There's a little plaque over in Stiles College about that. Next time you're in Stiles College, look for it. It's right near the entrance to the dining hall. Jenny, Tully, Ambo, Cass, Desire, Jude, and so on. Those Africans, mostly Africans, or African Americans, got here by, of course, the enormous African Atlantic slave trade. Time doesn't allow in this course for me to go into an elaborate lecture on the slave trade, and I won't. But it is, of course, one of the huge contexts for how all these folks got here. It is the largest forced migration of human beings in history until probably all the disposed or displaced persons of World War II and the Holocaust. The numbers are, and this has been a huge and political debate for years, Sorry, I should have advanced to the first slide. There we are. Just part of the list. This largest forced migration in history came about because of many, many reasons. The collision of societies with larger and different and greater, in some cases, forms of technology, and a variety of other goods that Africans wanted from Europeans, from the first Portuguese who landed on the upper northwest coast of Africa in the 1450s, 60s, and 70s, and established the first slave forts. But also, the Europeans wanted something from Africa. Yeah, they're going to want cola nuts, and they're going to want gold. They're going to never give up on the idea they're looking for gold, even though they didn't find a hell of a lot. But what they most wanted from Africa was people. It's one of the most tragic business, commercial arrangements in all of human history. It lasted approximately 400 years from the first encounters of the Portuguese with African peoples along the coast, well into the 19th century, and it wasn't really ending until the late 19th century, even though it had been declared illegal almost everywhere. The numbers are astonishing, and they are sometimes just numbers. I'm going to run this ahead to a map, just real quickly. That's not the best map I could have put up, but it serves for the moment. Several years ago, actually 10 or 12 years ago now, my center here, the Gilder Lehrman Center, produced both online and a digital site called slavevoyages.com, which already existed, but we produced an atlas, a book, an atlas of the Atlantic slave trade. We hired cartographers, brilliant cartographers, and they produced over 200 maps. It was edited largely, almost entirely, by David Richardson and David Eltis, two great historians of the slave trade. David Bryan Davis, my predecessor, wrote the introduction. I wrote an epilogue. But this book is, on the one hand, a beautiful atlas, if you like maps, about a horrible story. The numbers are here. The geographic movement of peoples by decades, by periods of time, by centuries, and by place are all here. You can learn all sorts of things from this, not least of which is that about 60% of all the Atlantic slave trade came to the Americas south of the equator. At periods of time, it's really all about Brazil, and it's about the Caribbean. The vast, vast majority of Africans caught up in this lethal trade came south of the equator, came to the island economies of the Caribbean and the massive sugar economy and cotton of Brazil and other parts of South America. The American South was not even part of this until the second and third centuries of this massive trade. It also must be said that African peoples had forms of enslavement and slave trading and the movement of peoples, even as chattels, but also as different kinds of bondspeople, sometimes developed through kin networks. They had these systems long before any Europeans arrived on that continent. Slavery has been practiced by every civilization, frankly, that we know of at one time or another. But with this atlas and this great scholarship that's now been done on the Atlantic slave trade, it's one of the great achievements of modern scholarship, was to do what 50 years ago, 60 years ago, nobody thought we could ever know. How many Africans came? Where did they really come from? Where did they end up? No. By uncovering through this intrepid research. I didn't do this research. These other people did. We now have good evidence of well over 90% of all slave voyages, which means their departing numbers and their arrival numbers, and where, and who owned the ships, and the names of the ships, which are often called, of course, names like Desire, the good ship Jesus, the good ship Hope. But the numbers, folks, numbers are politics, but numbers are also a narrative. Just start somewhere in the middle of the trade. Let's say 1601 to 1625, when the first English colonies are established here in North America. The total numbers of the slave trade were approximately 352,000 people, just from 1601 to 1625. 1626, 1650. Another 315,000. Then it kicks in terrifying numbers. 1651 to 75, up to King Philip's War. The numbers reach almost 490,000. 1676 to 1700, the eve of the establishment of Yale College, 718,000. These are just increments of 25 years. 1726 to 1750, now you're in the 18th century, the great century, or the horrifying century of the slave trade. 1726 to 1750, 1.4 million crossing the Atlantic. 1751 to 1775, to the eve of the American Revolution, 1.9 million people in the Atlantic slave trade, in thousands of ships. And then still more. From 1776 to 1800, the last quarter of the 18th century, in the wake of the American Revolution and the French Revolution and the Haitian Revolution, slightly more than 2 million enslaved people from Africa. And it begins to dip down, but only to 1.8 million between 1801 and 1825, despite the outlawing of the slave trade in the British Empire, and the outlawing of the slave trade by Americans, at least the attempt at it. Then comes the huge decrease. From 1826 to 1850, still 1.7 million people, mostly to Brazil now. This 19th century trade is mostly to Brazil, where it's still legal, although the British keep trying to stop the Portuguese on the high seas. And then finally, from 1851 to 1867, about 225,000. A grand, horrible total of somewhere between 12.5 million and about 12.8 million Africans transported from the vast coasts of Africa to the Americas. About 12.5 million people. With death rates on the slave ships, depending on what century you look at, which decade you look at, the size of ships, etc., where they're going, how long the voyages, storms, etc. Death rates ranging from as low as 5 to 8% to as high as 20 and 25%, and averages in there around 10 and 12% on every ship. Parts, trickles, portions of that trade end up right here in New England, in this upper part of North America. And by the time those founders met out in Saybrook and then moved this fledgling little college over to New Haven, and by the time they found Elihu Yale in London, who would give them about 1,000+ pounds of goods and cloth and books and some cash, at a moment when they just were deciding to build a new building, a new dormitory, a new kind of classroom dormitory, which they had to name. And since they got their largest donation ever from Elihu Yale in 1718, they decided to call it Yale College. First, they named the building. Then they decided, we don't have a name yet. It's all in the book. So this is how this place became Yale College. Elihu Yale never set foot here. Elihu Yale was born in Boston, but as a child emigrated to England with his family. His brother came here to New Haven at one point, but not Elihu. And I urge you, the painting's in the book in black and white, but I urge you to go right across the street at some point and see the famous painting of Elihu Yale with his, close family and attendants, but with the slave boy in the corner, which was a very common feature of 18th century portraiture of British aristocrats with the iron collar on. Several years ago, we did a conference with the British Art, amazing conference with the British Art Center about all that portraiture that they own. And we did an entire 2.5-day conference interpreting those paintings. It is amazing what art historians have done with that painting. It's now across the street and very well and beautifully interpreted, finally, by Yale itself. Used to hang in the trustees' room in Woodbridge Hall for years. I don't know when it was first put there, but finally some years ago, not that long ago, somebody, I don't know who, that's not research I really want to do, like who challenged, I don't know, somebody in the trustees apparently said, maybe we ought to move this painting. That little boy in the corner with the iron collar, I don't like looking at that. And they moved it, but it hung there for years. It's now properly in a museum and properly interpreted, although everybody loves to debate how it's interpreted, I'm sure. A quick word about these founders, and then I want to move right on to, to Samuel Sewall and Jonathan Edwards, and then up to the Revolution. These are the actual signatures of the 10 founders. I don't know what this does visually. I don't even know what it does having a page like this. I took it out of one of the old books about Yale. I may have said this the first day, I don't remember. There are dozens and dozens of histories of Yale. Some of them are amazing. They go all the way back to the 18th century. This comes from a book by a man named Oviatt. It was published in 1916, and it is one of the few histories of Yale where we found the acknowledgement of slave owning 2 or 3 times in the book in 1916. I actually used that book a lot because it had great detail in it. Good stuff. Old books are sometimes really useful to people like us. I've always wanted to teach a course at Yale called Great Bad Old Books. You just read a bunch of old oldies but goodies, and then you try to figure out why were they important then. Oviatt's book was a serious history, but he actually had a page, a visual, with the signatures of the 10 founders. It includes, of course, Timothy Woodbridge. Woodbridge was from Hartford. Of the 10 founders, 7 of them we know for sure were slaveholders. And Woodbridge enslaved the most. That's not necessarily why his name is sort of number 1 on Woodbridge Hall. It's not, I don't think. He first enslaved indigenous people, whom he appropriately baptized, he said. His name was John Waubin, quote, my Indian servant. In his will, dated 1732, Woodbridge, Yale graduate eventually, or his family became Yale graduates, and he had a large extended family. He, quote, gave his loving wife, Abigail Woodbridge, the improvement of John Waubin during the time he is bound to serve me. Woodbridge also, over time, enslaved a whole variety of people. Tamar, Andrew, Lydia, Isabella, Daniel, another Isabella, and a Caesar, who were apparently married, Thomas and Thorne, in addition to a Native American man named, as I said, John Wabin. He separated some families for sale. Eventually, he had a hand in the ownership of about 31 people. I say this not to condemn Timothy Woodbridge. He just had the most money. But it was a common practice, unchallenged, by and large, unchallenged in his own time, at least in the first half of his own century. The first challenge, whoops, I gotta back up. Not a portrait of Jonathan Edwards, it's a wood carving. Makes him, I don't know, does he look scary or muted or I don't know what. I want to contrast briefly here Samuel Sewall with Jonathan Edwards. They are two Puritans who come to have different approaches to slavery. They're both very important figures. And then I will move beyond that to get to this problem of the coming of the American Revolution here at Yale and how it transformed this place. But we can't leave this question of Puritan slaveholding just yet. Samuel Sewall was Justice of the Massachusetts, he was Chief Justice of the Massachusetts Superior Court, born in England, emigrated as a child about 1661. He was a judge and a merchant and a famous diarist. A lot of the Puritans were great diarists. He's a deeply religious Puritan, but by 1700 and even before that, he was deeply worried about the declension of the faith, about the growth of slavery, and he's going to write The Selling of Joseph, this first anti-slavery, in its own ways, anti-slavery text published in the American colonies. And he's doing it now in a world of tremendous turmoil, religious, political, military turmoil back in England, especially from the 1670s and 1680s on with the Glorious Revolution, and before that, the English Civil War. All of that turmoil, all that violence in England, all of that tearing apart from within in England, he inherited, or he learned, or he knew. He is part of this tremendous wave of religious war and strife that swept over that Anglo-American world in the second half of the 17th century. The book, it's a very short treatise, The Selling of Joseph, is both a lament, but also an altar call, classic Puritan altar call to the faithful to save their own souls and that of the slaves. Slavery, Sewall tends to argue here, in his own kind of moderate ways, will destroy them if they don't destroy it. It's written in the structure of a sermon, surprise. He names all sorts of biblical texts, which he then, of course, analyzes in the classic sermonic mode. He roots his case in several scriptures, especially Acts 17, God hath made of one blood all nations of men for to dwell on all the face of the earth, one blood. Then the golden rule, of course, do unto others, etc. And then Exodus. The line in Exodus, he that stealeth a man, or if he be found in his hand, he shall surely be put to death. Sewall is going to make the classic case that Jonathan Edwards is going to as well. Slave trading was murder. Slave trading was stealing people as captives and transporting them and selling them. It's unchristian, it's wrong, it's evil. Slaveholding becomes a problem. Sewall was cautious in this text. Slave trade, he declared horrible and murder, unquote, quote unquote, but he had no solution for what to do if slaves were freed. A classic conundrum of American abolitionism from this earliest text. It's going to be the same problem for the next century and a half. As many Americans, even down to the radical abolitionists, have a devil of a time figuring out what are we going to do with people when we free them, or if they free themselves. He worried. In fact, the whole text is written by a worried man. Give a Puritan a text to write while he's worried, and you got Puritanism. He was worried about the rising number of Africans in New England. He lived in Boston, which had a large number in the city, just like New York did. You know, New York in the colonial period had as much as 15 to 18% of their population was black and enslaved. Race was the conundrum. Still is for Americans, isn't it? Apparently it is in Springfield, Ohio now, too. Well, race, Sewall argued, the problem of race had poisoned the reasoning of these New England Puritans. He wanted to believe that human beings were equal. He wanted to believe they could be equal. But then he goes into these relatively long riffs about how their hair is different and their skin is different and their capacities are different. And it's kind of classic old-style scientific racism. He was trapped in the tragic assumptions about blood. I mean, he's not alone in this, is he? Over time. How much blood do you have from this side and that side? And blood. The document, though, is amazing for when it was done. It is this remarkable mixture of humanism, early Enlightenment humanism, with racism. And we're going to give you at least an article or two about it, if not the full the students, if not the full text, and it'll be on the server, and Michael Hepp will send it to all of you. You get to read The Selling of Justice. It's not very long. It's an amazing document. But then let's talk briefly about Edwards. Why did I put Edwards in that first chapter? My colleagues, were not sure I should have, blah, blah, blah. Edwards is probably the most famous Yale graduate of the 18th century. There were a whole bunch of them, a whole bunch of them. And some of them became presidents of Yale. And some of them became lots of other things. But no one still sort of strides across the world quite like Jonathan Edwards, believe it or not. And we can dislike him, we can hate him, we can say, oh God, he's the forerunner of all that evangelical Christianity that's all run amok. But don't underestimate Jonathan Edwards' influence across the globe. We have here at Yale the Jonathan Edwards portal, the research portal. His papers have been edited here for years by Ken Minkema and others. Ken Minkema's brilliant Edwards scholar here at Yale, and was a huge help to me on this project. I've always been fascinated with Edwards. My own brother wrote a dissertation on Edwards, and I always wondered why. I figured it out. I was never quite the same after I was forced to read Edwards' Freedom of the Will in an intellectual history class in my first year of graduate school at Wisconsin. That text sort of fried me for a while. Jonathan Edwards was born up in Windsor. He ends up starting his serious formal studies at age 13, Wethersfield, Connecticut, the town of the onions, famous for onions. And not only famous for onions, but provided the onions to the West Indies. He first studied in a tiny schoolhouse that the students shared with a family of Native Americans. He literally lived with two other young people named Ambo and Desire, who were Native American. Now, Edwards' interest in Native Americans will last the rest of his life, and he will run missions for Native Americans, and he believed Native Americans were equal before God, had the same capacities for both evil and good, and so on and so on. He's going to get his degree from Yale at age 17 in 1720. The boy was a prodigy, to say only the least. He becomes a combination. I'm not going to go into all of it, believe me, I couldn't, into all of his treatises and all of his writings. He was the most prolific theologian of the 18th century. He read everything in moral philosophy. He read lots and lots and lots of people he sort of despised and always disagreed with, but he read them. He read the scriptures next to Isaac Newton. Edwards came to sort of believe in the scientific revolution. At the same time, it had to fit his theology of God's design. All races, all peoples, to Edwards, were created in God's image. They were equal in their godliness and in their capacity for evil. Thank you, Jonathan. Slaveholding, he never criticized, and he did it through most of his adult life. The slave trade, however, he had the same problem Sewall had, but to Edwards, the Atlantic slave trade was unmitigated evil until the people arrived here, and then they were the responsibility of their owners, of the New England Puritans. He lives this theology and examined it like no one else ever. This series of multiple contradictions that was Puritanism, piety and oppression together, slaveholding as unchallenged privilege based on the Old Testament, and nevertheless, buying and selling them, though, was unmitigated evil. Edwards embodied this idea that through faith, through Christian piety, through his own vision of a Puritan God, who was, of course, almost utterly unforgiving, nevertheless, slavery could be made humane. It could be made humane. The conundrum of slaveholders the world over. Some have worried about it, some haven't, most haven't. You can find systems of slavery around the world where the slaveholders didn't leave a lot of evidence of being guilty. These Puritans had a problem with some of that, to say the least. But to Edwards, slavery was a natural thing. It's been around forever. But the slaveholder must never abuse the power he had over enslaved people. He wrote treatises on about every element of theology you can think of. He was a philosopher of the mind, the nature of the mind and how it functions. It's one of the reasons he has survived in modern philosophy. Even the great William James, who had almost nothing to do with evangelical Christianity, really admired Edwards. So did a whole lot of other American modern philosophies, because they had never encountered a mind like this on the page. He wrote a lot of moral philosophy, always arguing with the earlier moral philosophers. He wrote theological defenses of Calvinism endlessly. That is, a God directing the universe, a God declaring and determining a hierarchy among people, and a God controlling your will as you push back trying to have a human will. One of his most famous writings, popular, now it's hard to call that text popular, but it's the text called Freedom of the Will. Freedom of the Will is a very complicated text at first, but it does come down to this. It was Edwards' way of saying, of course you have a will. It drives you, it motivates you, you have wants of all kinds, you have desires of all kinds, and you're going to express them. But God thought of them first. God predates every act of will by you, and God will judge every act of will by you at the same time. And he even designs a logic. This is what's so troubling about Edwards to some people. He designs a logic by which, as soon as you think you have freedom of the will, well, you look back a little closer, and what came before that wish, and then what came before that wish, and then what came before that want, and what came before that desire, and pretty soon, where do you end up? God. And you are left reading Freedom of the Will, wondering, is there any freedom of the will? And Edwards' answer was ultimately no. And in this world of the Enlightenment, at this place called Yale College, where they're training all these young ministers, and 50% of all ministers all across New England were trained right here by the 1750s, 60s, and 70s. It's becoming a world that believes in things like science, believes in all there are new forms of technology now. And pretty soon, there are going to be these massive political revolutions against monarchy and against all kinds of hierarchy. And these revolutions are going to believe in things like reason and rationality. What are you going to do with rationality if you don't have any free will? Edwards was confounding and roundly hated by many other theologians, at the same time usually respected. It's crazy. I don't want to dwell on this any longer, but this past, I don't know, June, I think it was, I try to work every day in the Beinecke on my new book when I have time. And I'm in there day after day after day, and one day Ken Minkema, the Edwards Project, and a couple Beinecke curators came to me and said, "You're not going to believe what's about to happen here." There was a huge busload of evangelical Christians from, I think, Oklahoma, but I may not be it hopes here she'd remember. I forget where they were from. They are absolute devotees of Jonathan Edwards and his wife Sarah. The women were all about Sarah. He's their patron saint. And Ken Minkema invited me into the room where he was giving a presentation. I went in. They were praying for Ken. God bless them. They didn't pray for me. Come on, man. And before it was over, most of them were on their knees in the Beinecke Library, because these people see Jonathan Edwards as their founder. Now, we can all poke holes like crazy in their logic and whatever we want. Ken Minkema was unnerved that day. I mean, Ken knows his Edwards. He knows Puritanism like the back of his hand. He's a great scholar. But he came out of the thing, I don't know what to do. They're on their knees and they're praying for me. I said, "That's your problem, Ken. I'm going back to work." Edwards has far more followers in India and China and Japan and all over Africa and all over the world than he does in America. It's amazing. I don't know how they read parts of his treatises, but they seem to. Edwards embodied, so did Samuel Sewall in a genuinely anti-slavery tract, but Edwards especially embodied this tortured, unattainable idea of religious and theological perfection that the Puritans sought. It's a kind of you could call it a fool's errand. I wouldn't call it a fool's errand. I'd call it an impossible errand. And in some ways a tragic errand. It's not going to work. It's going to run headlong into this collision with Enlightenment ideology and with the age of revolution. Although some of the sentiments, especially the temperaments of Puritanism, of course, in this country, have never died. I don't know, for some of you of a certain age like me, I was raised in a Lutheran church. I escaped, but I didn't escape the Lutheranism. I didn't escape a whole bunch of assumptions which Luther would never have said went back to Calvin and the Puritans, although they do. Their worst unattainable goal was to make slavery humane, and therefore available to be justified. That's their most tragic, unattainable contradiction. I use the word tragic there. It sounds like a throwaway word, but for just 1 second. Actually, I'll save my riffs on tragedy for the moment. The other big context for the American Revolution here at Yale, of course. There we go. This is Ezra Stiles. The 7 Years' War. I don't have time to go into it all, but it is the world's first real world war between the French and the British from 1750 to 1763. That massive war fought on 3 continents was a struggle, among other things, for the frontier of this North American society of native peoples, British peoples, French peoples, and others. Massive war, massive bloodletting, fought all over the high seas. Finally ends, mostly, in 1763. And that other context, which I've just said, is the Atlantic slave trade. And then finally, one of the biggest contexts to understand what it's like here in southern Connecticut and at Yale College on the eve of and during the American Revolution is the ties that Connecticut and New Haven and Yale had to the West Indies. The ties they had, we have a whole chapter on this in the book, so I welcome you to read and I started that chapter by simply a narrative description of how a sugar mill worked, the kind of horrid labor conditions of a sugar mill in Jamaica. We have a lot of testimony about that. And from there I went on to the nature of the economic ties and the trade. The Sugar Revolution kicked in the 1660s. It would change the diets and the tastes of people across the world. It would change is a nice word, a limited word, for the economies of the Caribbean, the economies of North America, and the economies of Europe. It would turn rum, the creation of rum, pounding sugar into molasses and eventually refining it into rum. It would turn rum into the elixir of the Atlantic trade. And it would become a major consumption item of the 17th and certainly the 18th century world. In Britain alone, there were 270 gallons of rum refined in 1698, but by 1771, the eve of the American Revolution, there were 2 million gallons of rum being refined per year in Great Britain. Rum refineries developed all over New England, including right here in New Haven. Indeed, the northern colonies became the nexus of the rum trade and therefore the sugar trade and therefore the slave trade. It will fuel shipbuilding in New London and New Haven, Connecticut. And Connecticut developed an economic link to the West Indian sugar nexus, sugar plantation nexus, by trading, selling all manner of agricultural products, livestock, you name it, horses, cattle, onions, wheat, wood products of all kinds, farming tools, even the dung to be used for fertilizer on those sugar plantations was shipped aboard these ships out of New Haven Harbor. Yeah. Every ship that went, not every ship, about 45% by the middle of the 18th century of all ships leaving New Haven's harbor, same with New London, same over to Newport, same over to Boston, even over 50% in Boston, headed directly to the West Indies to support the Sugar Islands. And in return came sugar, molasses, rum. That was the nature of this dark and kind of terrible trade. But the economy of Connecticut, its ferry boats moving stuff on the rivers, its onion production, its livestock production. Every ship that went out of this harbor heading for the West Indies had cattle on it, horses to run the sugar mills. They didn't have any horses in Jamaica. They got them from here. This entanglement, this web of commerce, this slave owning and slave trading, fortunes were made, and many of those fortunes were in the hands of Yale donors and Yale professors. In the book, we developed several stories, the Saltonstalls, the Livingstons especially of New York, and please read those. There are Yale graduates and alumni families that were deeply involved in the sugar trade, and in the Livingston's case, the African slave trade. Now, the revolution came to New Haven as it came everywhere along the coast of North America, later than other places. It's not going to arrive here, the war, until approximately 1778 and 79. Already by then, though, there are black Connecticuters. I suppose you might call them nutmeggers today or something. I don't know, I hate that term. But there were people like Prince Duplex. One of my favorite finds in our research was this man named, I love the name for one, Prince Duplex Sr. He was born into slavery. He ended up living in New Haven. He became free and was listed as a basket maker by the time he enlisted in 1777 in the Continental Army. He'll serve 3 years and survive. And we have, I develop in the book, how black soldiers got into this war and their status and so forth. He would fight in the Battle of Germantown in October of 1777 with Washington's army, and he spent the entire winter at Valley Forge in 1778 with Washington's army and nearly starved and froze to death. The price of his freedom was 40-some pounds sterling, and freezing nearly to death at Valley Forge, because when he got out of the army after 3 years, he somehow had to pay off somebody, probably the man who he replaced. Part of the way black soldiers got into the war was as replacements for white men. And they had to pay off those white men with their wages. And then even earlier, there was this remark, we've put it on the canvas for you, and you've already read it probably. This amazing petition by Bristol Lambie. Read that text, folks. It's one of the most remarkable texts. It ought to be among the sort of founding American texts. They should put this baby up in that front hall of the National Archives. Bristol Lambie wrote a petition to the Connecticut legislature, at that point still the colonial legislature, demanding the natural rights to liberty for black people. And he was writing on behalf of many others. It is called, quote, the humble petition of a number of poor Africans, unquote. It was addressed to, quote, the Sons of Liberty of Connecticut. He butters them up. He makes the most zealous assertions in this petition of natural rights and liberties, quote, natural rights and liberties of mankind. How did Bristol Lambie learn his natural rights tradition? Not from reading John Locke, probably, but from the environment, from the air, from the discussions, probably down at a tavern where people were arguing about this damn British. The petition asks for, quote, deliverance from a state of unnatural servitude and bondage. Unnatural. He invoked the law of nature and of liberty. And he said, we have, quote, a natural right to be free. I'll stop there on Lambie, but in the book, I make a case, and I spent a couple paragraphs making the case that you can find all of Jefferson's 4 first principles in Lambie's petition. And what are those 4? Don't you hate that? Somebody, come on, give me the 4. I just named one. Natural rights. The idea that all human beings, by birth in this world, from nature or God, have a certain set of inalienable rights. What's the second first principle in liberty? You have a right to liberty. What's the third one? The doctrine of consent. Consent. The idea of representative government. No government exists without the consent of the people. What's the fourth? The right of revolution. Whoa, Jefferson went a long way there. All 4 of those, 2 of them utterly explicitly, the other 2 mostly implied, are all in Lambie's petition before Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence. There were numerous declarations of independence in the American colonies. Now, the Revolutionary War, and by the way, already around here at Yale, among its own graduates, is forming an anti-slavery and, in a couple of cases, genuinely abolitionist mentality and tradition, namely among Jonathan Edwards' own son, Jonathan Edwards Jr., and his fellow theologian, all trained at Yale, Samuel Hopkins. They're in the book. Check them out. Now, the war comes here, and I'll stop with this. The war comes here in 1779, just after Ezra Stiles becomes president of this place. There he is. The gentle Puritan, as Ed Morgan called him in his brilliant biography. I didn't know anything about Ezra Stiles until I had to write this book. I came to really kind of admire Stiles. Sorry about that. And I will end on this. He grows up mostly over in Newport, Rhode Island. He was a Yale grad, a minister, a pastor of a church in Rhode Island, but he became deeply interested in Judaism and Hebrew. He learned Hebrew. He attended synagogue. He didn't really want to be president of Yale, but they kind of put the screws on him. Yale was in financial crisis as the war broke out. Nobody knew the future. There's this huge revolutionary war going on. I'm going to go be president of Yale College, and who knows if Yale will survive at all. He kept an incredible diary. He called being president of Yale his crown of thorns. I said earlier, he liberated his slave named Newport when he took this job. The American Revolution will change it. Events do change some people. Some people are impervious to change. Some people get in the way of big events and it sweeps over them and they come out different. Ezra Stiles did. He helped create an African missionary project. Think whatever you want of missionary projects. Stiles had, by a whole variety of means, an absolutely boundless curiosity in science, in literature, in all kinds of theologies, in all kinds of historical subjects. Yale was supposed to hire a Hebrew scholar while he was right after the Revolutionary War. He decided they're hard to find. So he studied up again and he learned Hebrew and he became the Hebrew professor. Same happened with another subject. He will actually lead a group of militia when the British invaded New Haven Harbor with between 35 and 40 ships in July of 1779. Some students were in that militia, some faculty were in that militia. Former President Daggett was in it. He got captured. The former president of Yale got captured. We're in this militia. It was a terrible battle. The British came into New Haven Harbor, and they could have burned Yale and destroyed it. They only spent one night on the town green, camped out. And the story is they got so drunk. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's what they say in most of these books. They got so drunk that the next day their officers just said, we don't need to stay here. And they went back to the harbor. But before they did, over in East Haven, down to West Haven, and right on into the streets of New Haven, they fought a pitched battle in which dozens were killed on both sides and even more wounded. It was a bloody, bloody battle. For reasons unknown, although they pillaged a lot of buildings in New Haven, they didn't burn the college. They didn't burn its... in the wake of the war, Ezra Stiles will take hold of this thing called Yale College, begin... He had a lot of help. And by the way, it was said that he was a terrible administrator. He just got bored with administration. He'd rather go read. Probably a few administrators here today who are here because they'd rather be reading. He'd rather go read world literature, Hebrew, science, Isaac Newton, anything. But he would begin to move Yale into the Enlightenment and into teaching science. And he cut a deal with the state legislature that gave Yale, it appeared, won't last forever, but it appeared to be a permanent subsidy of public money, such that for a while Yale was not entirely a private school. It was supported by the state of Connecticut. So when they get on you out there, you're going to one of them big fancy private universities. It wasn't always that way. 1790, I forget the exact date now, 1790 whatever. He fully supported the 1784, Stiles did, gradual abolition law. Stiles, like almost all Yale people in the 18th century, had a lot of conservative to moderate sensibilities, elements of his temperament. He helped create the first, although it was short-lived, abolition society in Connecticut. He was a huge supporter of the French Revolution, which his successor will not be. He wrote a treatise on democracy. And he ended up a kind of Enlightenment figure at the helm of this place when he died. He will be replaced, however, by Timothy Dwight, who hated the American Revolution and hated the French Revolution and believed the French were nothing but a series of conspiracies against Protestantism. You'll see this in the book. Yale goes through these tides and changes, partly because of its leadership and partly because of the forces of history swirling around them. I think I've run out of time, but I want to leave you with this. Next Tuesday, you're going to hear from my brilliant colleague, Mike Moran. Some of you know Mike from the Beinecke. Mike wrote our chapter on the 1831 Black College, or the aborted 1831 Black College. He'll develop the early 19th century moment up to that 1831 moment. I'll be here, introduce him, but we're going to have one guest lecture, and that's going to be by my man Mike Moran on next Tuesday. Don't miss it.